Hello lovely people, and welcome to another video from Saturday Night Stitch. My name is Hila and thank you so much for tuning in. So we're carrying on with making this dress from Burda, and it's the cover dress from Burda 6 2023, and it's dress number 103. So we're picking up from where we left off, where we finished preparing the bodice pattern pieces and we cut out the skirt pattern pieces. Following the principles of mise en place, we are basically trying to prepare everything so that we sort of do most of the sewing, most of the ironing, most of the overlocking in one go. So some of these things don't seem to make sense until they do. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to be attaching those pocket pieces that we prepared in the last video. So I'm adding pockets to this pattern because, well, let's face it, pockets are everything. My sweet spot is exactly 2.5 inches below the waistline. That tends to work quite well for me. I have a pre-made pocket template that I use every single time that I have to add pockets to anything. So the first thing is to see where it's marked. So if you've notched it, it's also a good idea to use tailor's chalk or a marker so that you can see where it is, because sometimes when you overlock, it's not necessarily easy to see where your notch is. So I'm going to attach all 4 of the pocket pattern pieces. 2 of them go to the upper skirt front and 2 of them will go onto the skirt backs. And I'm just using my wonder clips to clip them on there because I'm going to go over to the sewing machine and I am going to sew them within the overlocker allowance. But before I get started sewing, I tend to try and estimate how many bobbins a project is going to require. And for this one, I think it's going to be a 1 bobbin project, and I try to preload all of my bobbins before I actually do the sewing. So for shirts, it tends to be 2 bobbins. For dresses that have sleeves, it tends to be 2 bobbins. So this one is 1 bobbin. So that's loaded, and I shouldn't have to stop and reload the bobbin, which is something that I thoroughly dislike having to do. With the pockets sewn on using a very scant seam allowance, I move on to doing the gathering stitches. And I know you're probably thinking, shouldn't we be pressing it? But I tend to try and do all of my pressing in one go. Trust me, the system works. So for the gathering stitches, I use a stitch length of 4.5, which is the widest stitch length I have on my machine. And I'm just going to do, I think it works out at about, the first line is 1/4 of an inch. And then the second line is 1/2 inch in, which works out well with my 1/2 inch seam allowances. And I make sure that I have very long tails either side so that it is easy to pull those gathering stitches. And we're going to do this for all of the skirt panels, including the lower skirt panels and the upper skirt panels. And so it's just getting all of that done in one go. It's now at this point that I will press that pocket seam allowance, and I press the seam allowances towards the protruding pocket. And oh, this fabric, oh my gosh, it irons so beautifully. I really enjoy pressing this fabric, and I know I'm going to have fun doing laundry on this dress because it just irons in such a gorgeous way. Now we're going to move on to sewing the bodice together. So I'm going to start off with the back. And I've kept these pattern pieces together because in the past I very easily mixed up the princess seam lines because of how they sort of are straight but have a slight curve. And so just to always be on the safe side to make sure that I get the correct seam attached, and this is because in the past I have made mistakes before, and I found that this is a foolproof way to make sure that it doesn't go wrong, is I will just pin them straight away with the pattern pieces still on there so that it's all done. I don't have the meticulous mind that is able to keep on top of these things, and sometimes when I'm in a rush because I'm so excited by the fabric and I can't wait to wear it, I can make silly mistakes. But I've, ever since I started doing this pokey way of just foolproofing my idiotic tendencies when I'm in a rush to get the project done because I can't wait to wear it, and it works with princess seam lines. So I remove those pattern pieces at the very last moment when everything has been pinned together. And with princess seam lines, I basically pin the topmost bit and right at the bottom. And I know that some instructions will tell you to use copious amounts of pins, but I have learned through the Janet Prey method on her craftsy classes how to sew without using pins. So I use pins very minimally, and it does work. It felt counterintuitive when I started, but now it's just second nature, and I'll use the pins just to keep pieces that I want to make sure stay together. So having done that for the back, I'm also going to pin the front pattern pieces as well, using the same idea, the same concept of making sure that I get the sides and the seam lines correctly. I'll pin those, and then I'll go over to the sewing machine and I will sew them in one go. So all 4 of those seams will get sewn up one after the other. Princess seam lines, I think, are the most universally flattering seam lines because it makes it a lot easier to adjust for a full bust or for a small bust. However, sewing them can be a little bit tricky, but I found that doing these few things, they do reduce the trickiness of dealing with princess seam lines. Number one, use narrower seam allowances. So I use a 1/2 inch seam allowance, which makes it easier to feed it through and to ease the longer piece on the princess seam line, because you have one piece that is sort of convex shaped and you have another one that is sort of concave shaped, and so one of them will seem longer and it has to be eased in using the feed dogs. So whenever you're sewing a princess seam line, find which side is the longer one, which seems to be the longer section, and you put that against your feed dogs because that's the one that would need to be eased in. And I've honestly found this way to be a lot easier, and I learned this from the Janet Prey lessons on the craftsy classes, which are very useful because they teach you industrial sewing methods. And so I can do this without a need for copious amounts of pins or pre-stitching and then notching, etc. And so once they're done, I get so excited at this stage, guys, because everything is beginning to take shape now, and I have to slow down and be careful, take deep breaths so that I don't make silly mistakes. And what we need to do is to overlock all of the seams. And when I'm overlocking, I butt all of the seams together, if that makes sense. So that means that, so I'm doing this first seam, which is one side of the front bodice. And before I get to the end of it, I start feeding the other seam that needs to be cut out. I think they call it chain overlocking, because at the end of it, it looks like you've got a chain. And so what I'm doing is I'm making sure to cut off about 1/4 of an inch as I'm overlocking, so that the seam is nice and small, so that when I press it, there isn't going to be any bulkiness from the seam allowances. It's these little things that cumulatively over the course of a project, they make a project come together so much faster. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to overlock the center back on those back bodice pieces, because that's where the zipper is going to go, and we're going to neaten it up right now rather than trying to neaten it up once the zipper has been put in, because it adds the bulk. Now, when it comes to pressing, personally, I learned from the Susie Fur classes that you have to think about whether you want to press your seam allowances towards the center front or the center back. And for me, with the back pattern pieces, I'm pressing them towards the center back seam, that is towards where the zipper is going to be. And with the front, I'm pressing them towards the center front. And it's a very subtle effect, but because it's got the princess seam line, so you have that frontal panel, when you press it towards the center front, it does create almost like a slightly raised effect that I think is a lot more flattering than when you press the seam lines towards the side seam, because some people will press them towards the side seam. But again, it's all a personal preference, and honestly, the eventual outcome, it's very subtle, particularly when you're using a print pattern like this one. It's not even as visible, but if you were using something like a satin crepe in a solid color, you can see the difference. So for this one, that's how I've chosen to go with it. So I press them down, and again, this fabric is such a joy to press. I could have spent all day just pressing it. You could, if you wanted to, top stitch them down, and that would create a more spotty, more sportswear look. But I decided not to do that because this one is more of a casual dress for me. Princess seams, I think they're always best to be pressed on a tailor's hem. There is no way around it. If you want a really nice looking seam, you're going to have to use that tailor's ham with loads of steam, just to help everything to ease in together and for everything to lay nice and flat. And at this point, it's coming together nicely, and I can kind of begin to see what it's going to look like on me. And it is so exciting for me when I get to this point. This is my danger zone. I need to basically calm down and try and remain zen and focused. So here we are. We've got the front bodice pattern piece done, looking really, really lovely, I must say. So excited to finish this project. And then we've got the back bodice pattern pieces. They are done. They are ready for the next step that we're going to be doing. The skirt pattern pieces are also ready. So this is where we're going to stop for now, and until I see you next time, I hope that you found this useful. Be excited to finish it off in the next video. We'll definitely be finishing this off, and we can do a big reveal, which is just in time for spring, which has now arrived here in England. Until I see you next time, lovelies, happy sewing. Bye.